This is Lynn Fraser with the Killaby Center for Recovery with the Radical Recovery Summit and the series. And I'm here today with Grace Bubeck. And she's going to talk about her awakening journey and in specifics how she works with addiction. One of the really root addictions for many people is the thoughts that run through their mind. And they seem to drive a lot of compulsion and a lot of addiction. What's your experience with that?
Well, it's interesting because I would say that was my strongest addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's interesting how we're really aware of addiction to thought, to substances.
Right.
But we're not so aware of addiction to thinking until we become aware, right?
Right.
So, I remember there was a time, and I think that's there for a lot of people, when I was more into thinking positively and, the new age kind of thing, having positive thoughts instead of negative thoughts, thinking that would solve the suffering. And it's only when you become aware of how addicted you are to thinking that you realize that even the positive thoughts are not ultimately going to make a difference. I mean, they make a difference at some level. They're better than negative thoughts, self-critical thoughts, for example. That's always the worst ones.
Mm-hmm.
But the, it's thinking itself that we hold on to because, the difficult experience, whatever that is, seems to kind of, there's an automatic switch to the head. It takes us into the head and then we try and figure out what to do about it.
Right. Yeah.
So, and that's something that everybody is addicted to, whether they know it or not, that we grab for certain kinds of experiences.
Right.
And not ours.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, I came to see that one of the ways that I do screen out from something that's kind of like unpleasant, not doesn't feel good. I do that by going on the internet, and surfing. Now, that doesn't usually, unless it becomes totally dysfunctional, it's not usually called an addictive behavior.
Right.
But I know that there is a grasping there for something other than what is here in the moment, and an unwillingness to fully feel what is here. Everybody does that. Everybody has their kind of go-tos, right?
Right.
And it becomes dangerous if the go-to is a substance that's highly addictive.
What about the people who feel like they have it under control? So they have, a few extra cookies after work, or they have a glass of wine and, or they get on the internet, but it's not, they're using it for boredom or stress relief, but it's not really impacting them. So what would you say to them? What is it that's the benefit of working with it this closely? So you're really watching that mechanism at work.
What is really happening? What's the discomfort? And what do I do with discomfort? What do I do with experiences that don't feel good? A source of lasting happiness. The only source that I could find was my own being, true being. My own, the light of my own awareness. That's always there. And, it doesn't stop. It simply is.
Right.
I am. And that's blissful, or at least very peaceful. It's not stressful. It's not challenging. It's not any of those things because, when we're in the realm of experiences, yes, of course there will be challenges. There's good ones and bad ones, and we don't like the bad ones. In the spiritual realm, in non-dual circles, there's this whole discussion as to you know, if you're enlightened, if you're truly awake, you know, do you still have human foibles, so
Right.
to speak, or even worse things? You know, there can be an awareness of who we truly are, and yet, you know, personality is still there,
Mm-hmm.
and it still plays itself out. And my sense is actually that, to the extent that I know who I truly am, I take less issue with how things play themselves out in my life, you know, what I do, what my tendencies are. It's like, you know, at some level, it's just like, well, it just is as it is. You know, it's no longer a personal problem that I need to work on. And but when I see that I'm really not wanting, that I'm really avoiding a certain experience, then I will look, because there's something really, you know, there's something really calling me to bring awareness to that. You know, part of awakening is that you realize that knowing oneself is not an experience. You know, it can be very pleasant and very peaceful and very spacious and very blissful even, but that's not the essence of knowing oneself. You know, knowing oneself is beyond any experience.
Right.
So when people are looking, I mean, I know in my own history, you know, when I started meditating, the very first meditation that I did was very blissful.
Mm-hmm.
And that got me hooked on the search for the blissful experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a long time to realize that this wasn't about blissful experiences. When you see yourself more and more clearly, you know, both the true nature and also the conditioned nature, you know, whatever is here for this person at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And you start seeing the pattern so much more clearly.
Right.
Then you see also how you avoid, how you have a tendency to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you see that more and more clearly.
I find that the more that people heal the underlying trauma too, the more peaceful it gets. The more access we have to that, knowing our own true being and to resting in that, which is wonderful.
Yes.
And, you know, that can be a really important step in kind of a foundation for moving out into the world, is to be able to access that knowing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you know that knowing at some point, at any rate, it calls you back into the world, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like it almost has it has an inbuilt self-destruct of those avoiding tendencies, you know. You can only avoid for so long.
Right.
But if you're truly in the search for truth, you cannot avoid, you know, you cannot avoid yourself. You cannot avoid seeing what's so obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I have a great trust in this. You know, I know people say, oh, spiritual search is a way of avoiding, you know, dealing with your life. Yes, that's totally true, but only up to a certain extent. And then then you kind of like just having to face it, you know, full force.
Yeah.
Full force. I mean, there's no, because also, you know, all these ways that you had of avoiding, they keep getting deconstructed, you know?
Right.
So, and you keep seeing what you're doing. So there's no way you can avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't anyway. I mean, I don't know about others. Maybe others have a way of kind of, you know, just fencing off certain areas in their lives and really not looking at them. But I find that very unplausible.
Well, and I think people do that to the extent that they have to. But everybody wants to know themselves on a really deep, authentic level. And it's really just our defense mechanisms that get in the way of that.
Yeah.
So deep spiritual practice and really getting to know our bodies through meditation or our minds is really a good foundation for working with all kinds of avoidance and for coming home to being present with ourselves.
Whatever good experiences you get out of whatever it is, whatever the addictive behavior is, it just doesn't compare,
Yeah.
It's so obvious that it's very fleeting.
Mm-hmm.
It ends when it ends, and grabbing for more of this is not going to be any more satisfactory.
Right.
So, my sense is also that as we know true being, the tendency to grab for other ways of feeling good, just it kind of gets less and less, because it's so obvious that the goodness of a piece of chocolate cannot compare with the goodness of knowing oneself.
Mm-hmm.
And so somehow even that gets kind of deconstructed from the inside, as it were, because it just is, that there's just no comparison.
Right. One of the really root addictions for many people is the thoughts that run through their mind, and they seem to drive a lot of compulsion and a lot of addiction. What's your experience with that?
Well, it's interesting, because I would say that was my strongest addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting how we're really aware of addiction to thought, to substances.
Right.
But we're not so aware of addiction to thinking until we become aware, right?
Right.
So I remember there was a time, and I think that's there for a lot of people, when I was more into thinking positively and, the new age kind of thing, having positive thoughts instead of negative thoughts, thinking that would solve the suffering. And it's only when you become aware of how addicted you are to thinking that you realize that even the positive thoughts are not ultimately going to make a difference. I mean, they make a difference at some level. They're better than negative thoughts, self-critical thoughts, for example. That's always the worst ones.
Mm-hmm.
But the, it's thinking itself that we hold on to, because, the difficult experience, whatever that is, seems to kind of, there's an automatic switch to the head. It takes us into the head, and then we try and figure out what to do about it.
Right. Yeah.
So, and that's something that everybody is addicted to, whether they know it or not. So when I met my teacher, Gangaji, I went up to speak to her, and I told her about how my life was so much better, but there was one thing that was left that really bothered me. And it was that Buddhist truth about life being suffering. And she just turned that in a way that was so totally unexpected to me. She said, you really love that story, don't you? You really love that drama. And I had to agree. And in that becoming aware of the story that I was telling myself, it's like that's how thoughts started unraveling. And it was never quite the same, because the more you see that move into thinking, the more you're able to also just be with the rawness of whatever is here.
Mm-hmm.
Because then there's a choice. The moment you're aware of moving into thinking, you know, there's a choice about continuing the thinking or facing the whatever uncomfortable stuff is there, whatever doesn't feel good. And you know, not everybody has the good fortune. I mean, we all meet what we meet in different ways. I was just very fortunate to meet my teacher, and for there to be like that spiritual support to
Right.
to letting go of the thinking and the stories, you know, the many stories that I was telling myself. And
so partly what she was saying then is that you would rather engage in that thoughts about the suffering of the world than feel your own suffering?
No.
No?
It was really the thinking about my own suffering, which was, you know, summed up in life is suffering. And I should add to that I had been in psychotherapy for 9 years. So there was a lot of suffering in my life. I had a very difficult childhood in many ways. And so, you know, there was a lot of pain that kept coming up as I was in psychotherapy. And so the pain and the processing of the emotions and, you know, the emotional healing, all that was still very present to me at that point. And even though my psychotherapist was very good, she was not working at a level that was beyond the personal.
Right.
So I learned how to be kinder to myself, how to be more positive, less self-critical, how to deal with situation in a way that worked better for me, you know, all these things. And that was very helpful. I mean, I'm very grateful to her. But what I hadn't realized is that there was being beyond the person. There was truth beyond the person. And I still believe in that way, I still believed my story. I still believed that there was suffering in my life and I had to sort it out. And
so let's stop there, because that's a sticky point. So you had a difficult childhood. You had a lot of pain that would be surfacing, and you know, the effects of trauma are very well known now on the mind, the body, the nervous system. And so you still believe that there was suffering in your life. Can you go into that a little bit more? Because on one level, obviously, there was.
It was a bit less. It was a bit less personal at that point because a lot of the personal pain had gone away.
Okay.
But I was still running the story that life was suffering, you know, because at the time I had more of a Buddhist background. And one of the Four Noble Truths, in fact, the first one is life is suffering.
Right.
And that's what attracted me to Buddhism, because, you know, they just put that right up front.
Yeah,
you know, first noble truth, life is suffering. Yes, I knew that.
Yeah.
You know,
right.
And even though my own suffering at that point wasn't that gripping me that much anymore, I still had this thought that was really turning me against life. This thought that life was suffering, you know, that the essence of life was that it is painful. And of course that's true. But you know, what that belief did was it turned me against life. It was me against life.
So you were defending yourself against life.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Gangaji challenged me on that, that unraveled. And at one point, I could see that was a bit later, but I could see that there was nothing else but this. And this included me, it included everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I was no longer separate from life. Somehow the separation stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And the separation is created by thought. It's created by resistance. It's created by the thinking that this shouldn't be happening.
Right.
So that's why the unraveling of thoughts somehow in the end just also unraveled that separation from life, which is what is ultimately suffering, painful, the fact that we believe that this unease, whatever this is in the moment, shouldn't be happening.
Mm-hmm.
But it is,
Right. Yeah.
So.
Well, non-dual philosophy really works with that idea that this shouldn't be happening. And then in my experience too, the nervous system comes in and goes, well, I need to protect you from everything that's unpleasant.
Yeah.
And then, so therefore this shouldn't be happening. So it's kind of a angle in a way. So we have that resistance, and part of that with the hypervigilance that comes along with trying to protect us is that we can't go into our body. We can't really experience the moment because it's not safe to do that. And then our mind goes, I can get you right out of that moment. And away we go into thought, right?
Yes.
So can you just talk a little bit more about what that process was like for you? Seeing through, I think, when you met with Gangaji.
Yes. So, in psychotherapy, I learned to feel the feelings, but I didn't learn not to resist them.
Ah, okay.
So what I learned with Gangaji was that there was a way of feeling that was much more radical, that was no longer in resistance, that actually used whatever it was that was there to get to the ultimate truth of what is here.
Mm-hmm.
So in that, and she is very skilled in working with people in this way, in this very psychological way, but a way that takes them beyond the merely psychological.
Okay.
So what I saw over and over happening in her interactions with people, as well as, in my own kind of inquiry that I started doing, was that there was a way of being with feeling that didn't give it an independent existence. I don't know whether that makes sense, but it's like, there was a sense that whatever would happen if I connected with the feeling was going to take me to whatever the truth of this moment was. And so, sometimes what would happen, or often what would happen, is actually that the feeling would kind of ease off.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would be left with was just a sense of emptiness or a sense of meanness. At the time there was still much more of a sense of me.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes there was just emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one experience which was really very powerful. I still had also bouts of depression. They weren't as bad and not as debilitating as they had been before, but I still had them. And there was one moment when I remember I was lying in the bathtub and I was feeling utterly depressed. And, you know, I just inquired into that sense of depression, of darkness, of, you know, just utter powerlessness, whatever it was at the time. I don't remember totally exactly what the feeling was, but that's what I named as depressed, feeling depressed. And subsequently, I learned in speaking to other people and working with clients also that, of course, the feeling of depression can be quite different for different people.
Ah.
But for me, it was what it was. And I was there, and I just decided I was going to inquire into this feeling. I was going to go right into it. And in that, what happened was that it basically just gave way. It just became stillness. And I realized that this depression, which seemed black and empty, was nothing other than the emptiness that I was actually looking for. You know, that I was searching for in my spiritual search. And it was like, you know, something just switched. And that's the kind of switch that I often saw happening for people in their inquiry with Gangaji. And that happened for me, but maybe not that fundamentally as it did then, because, you know, the depression didn't come back in the same way after. So something really just, and what gave way, I think, reflecting on it afterwards, was this resistance to the depression, you know. And what also gave way was the fear of it, because a lot of the depression is actually fear of it.
Right.
So because I knew I could go into it and it would kind of just morph into something else, I was no longer afraid of it. And I didn't need to, you know, I didn't need to figure out what to do. And, you know, I was just willing for it to be what it was.
So then you have a new experience that it's okay, it's safe to be present with it, however it is.
Yes, it's like, I think ultimately you just really start trusting life in whatever it throws up for you, you know? And maybe the depression was like a last holdout in terms of what I didn't trust as experience. And actually, it wasn't the last. It wasn't the last.
No?
The last one was when I had cancer for the second time.
Oh.
And there was a lot of fear that came up for me at the time. Really fear of death, you know, because it was like the first time it wasn't so present. But the second time it was like, well, this could really kill me. And I wasn't ready to go. I was very clear about that. I'm still here. So I was obviously not ready to go.
Yeah.
But the fear kept showing up. And, you know, it was like this existential show off between the fear and whatever else was there.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes at night it would get so strong that I would literally just lie in bed and shake.
That's a strong, intense emotion.
Yes. But somehow, you know, there was trust in this experience in the sense that I knew I just had to face the fear.
Right.
I just didn't quite know how to do that because it was very strong.
Right.
You know, sometimes I was able to just witness the physicality of it and not get pulled into it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I just had to pray. I had to, I mean, I tried everything that I knew,
Right.
you know.
Right.
I knew how to do, and sometimes it would work and sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes I'd just be terribly afraid.
So it sounds like the psychotherapy was a way into your feelings, and
Mm-hmm.
it cleared a lot of things up. It made it more possible for you to stay. And
Yeah.
then the insight with Gangaji was something that took you beyond just a better psychological state into actually noticing the emptiness and to
Yes.
noticing that there's more here than our personal experience. Not to
Yes.
deny our personal experience, but there is more than just that.
Yeah, it was for me, it was a very gradual thing. There were experiences of really, you know, um, knowing things beyond the personal.
Mm-hmm.
There were many of those, but somehow the shift into really knowing that as my nature, as myself, was
Mm-hmm.
very gradual.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, and for me, the giving up of the fear, or this kind of, this facing of the fear of dying was a big shift,
Mm-hmm.
because somehow in that I just learned I just knew that I had no choice but to trust life, and that life could be trusted.
Right.
And it's hard to put these things into words.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, there was just like a sense of freedom and trusting life. Yeah, that's really the best way I can put it. And this trust in life is like it basically means that I'm not separate from life, and whatever life throws into my face, whatever comes up, whatever happens inside or outside, is trustworthy.
So
And
the notion that it has to be a certain way, that it has to show up a certain way, that was let go.
yes,
Right.
yes.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that sometimes I resist stuff. Of course I do. But
Mm-hmm.
I catch that very quickly, because the resistance is, either it's a thought that this shouldn't be happening,
Right.
or it's a kind of more, hardwired kind of don't want that.
Nervous system response, kind of. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But even that is just like it's just a reaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that can be seen, and when it's seen, then there's no need to stay with that. That's what I find.
Right. Right.
And the seeing comes from life. It comes from awareness. So the nervous system reaction, or the body reaction, that puts us at a distance with life, when it's seen,
Right.
it's like we're back into life. We're back with life. We're back with
Mm-hmm.
the awareness of this is happening, and it's trusted. It can just be seen.
Well, fear really is at the bottom of our avoidance of the moment. And when it gets strong like that, we really don't have much capacity to remember that it's all okay. Because our minds are very much taken up with the intrusive thoughts, catastrophic thinking. Yeah, I find it's really good to work on all of those levels. And, to really witness and recognize that there's more. And also to work on a very practical way. I'm not going to follow that train of catastrophic thoughts. I know where that goes. Suffering. So I'm not going to do that. And then sometimes, of course, we do. And then the kindness of just bringing ourselves back.
What I find fascinating, Lynn, is that for some people, it really is like that. They wake up, it's a huge shift out of the personality.
Mm-hmm.
And then the emotional conditioning comes up. It's still, it's still in the body.
It is. Yeah.
For most people, or some of it's gone and some of it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
And so they come to this seeing through awakening,
Mm-hmm.
in a radical shift.
Right.
But we can come to this seeing in a very gradual shift also.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, psychotherapy was part of the seeing, but it wasn't a kind of radical enough seeing. It was a self-awareness
Mm-hmm.
that still said, well, you need to fix this in this way,
Mm-hmm.
or you need to do this about this.
Mm-hmm.
And so the experience that's really the non-dual experience, which is a seeing that is so clear that the whatever emotional color is there or whatever physical condition is there, it's changed by that seeing. It's transformed by that seeing. It doesn't survive it quite in the same way.
Right.
And so, the freeing of these conditioned patterns, in my experience, just more and more happens through clear seeing.
Mm-hmm.
That's really all that's required.
Yeah, I would agree for sure. Yeah.
And that to me is like it's so powerful, it's such a discovery that's all it takes is just clear seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And that clear seeing is life giving me the opportunity to let go of that conditioning, of that reaction. And how beautiful is that,
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be the big dramatic. In fact, I think the big dramatic awakenings sometimes cause a lot of trouble. If we can assimilate as we go on, it's like having a shavasana practice at the end of yoga. It helps to assimilate all the energy and everything kind of settles. It's not causing so much trouble, which sometimes the big dramatic ones are really kind of discombobulating. And then, the work still has to happen of assimilation. And
yeah. Actually, I was, I was thinking this today, how grateful I am that there wasn't a big shift.
Mm-hmm.
That it was very gradual, because my nervous system is very sensitive,
Right.
and I don't know what would have happened with a big shift. I don't know I could have coped with that. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, we do tend to no, I'm not going to say. I was going to say we get what we need, but I'm not going to say that. That's not true.
No, it's true. We do get
well,
what we need.
On one level.
Yeah.
So many times people misinterpret that too and go, well, I'm getting all this crappy stuff, so that must be what I deserve. And so I don't want anyone to think that.
You cannot avoid yourself. You cannot avoid seeing what's so obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a great trust in this. I know people say, oh, spiritual search is a way of avoiding, dealing with your life. Yes, that's totally true, but only up to a certain extent. And then, then you kind of like just having to face it, full force.
Yeah.
Full force. I mean, there's no, because also, all these ways that you had of avoiding, they keep getting deconstructed,
Right.
So, and you keep seeing what you're doing. So there's no way you can avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't anyway. I mean, I don't know about others. Maybe others have a way of kind of, just fencing off certain areas in their lives and really not looking at them. But I find that very unplausible.
Well, and I think people do that to the extent that they have to. But everybody wants to know themselves on a really deep, authentic level. And it's really just our defense mechanisms that get in the way of that.
When you know true happiness, true bliss, whatever good experiences you get out of whatever it is, whatever the addictive behavior is, it just doesn't compare, you know. It's
Yeah.
so obvious that it's very fleeting, you
Mm-hmm.
know, it ends when it ends, you know, and grabbing for more of this is not going to be any more satisfactory.
Right.
So, you know, my sense is also that as we know true being, the tendency to grab for other ways of feeling good, just it kind of gets less and less, because it's so obvious that the goodness of, you know, a piece of chocolate cannot compare with
Mm-hmm.
the goodness of knowing oneself.
Go to KillibyCenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, for access to the interviews. You can watch them free online, or you could purchase an all-access pass. KillibyCenter.com.